The imperial decree didn't flutter, it landed on the stone floor of the Wen manor with the weight of a guillotine. Swapped. Wen Xi's voice was a sliver of ice in the humid reception hall. She didn't look at the silk-clad parents who had raised her for 20 years. She looked at the floor. It is the truth, Elevena, her mother, Ning Jean, sobbed into a lace handkerchief, though her eyes remained dry and darted toward the door. The Yen family has found their true daughter. And the Wen family, we must welcome our own blood home. You are a Yen. You belong to the general now. When she looked up then. In the doorway stood Yen Xiao, draped in the very furs when she had worn only yesterday. Yen Xiao gave a small, triumphant smirk, the look of a cuckoo who had successfully pushed the rightful bird from the nest. You're being traded, Yen Xiao whispered as she brushed past. From a scholar's daughter to a war beast's plaything. I wonder, sister, how long will you last in a bed made of iron? When she didn't flinch. She simply turned and walked out of the manor, leaving behind 20 years of lies without a single tear. Outside, the carriage waiting for her didn't bear the soft silk curtains of a scholar, it was armored in black steel, guarded by men whose scars told stories of slaughter. The door creaked open. Inside sat General Shang Chin. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply sat in the shadows, his presence filling the carriage like a predator in a cage. As the wheels began to turn, he leaned forward, his face caught in the moonlight. They say you cannot feel the cold, the general rumbled, his gaze traveling over her thin robes with a dark, simmering intensity. They say your heart is made of frost. When she met his eyes, her chin tilted high. Does that disappoint you, General? Shang Chin's hand moved, faster than a strike, gripping her chin and pulling her inches from his face. On the contrary, Scholar Wen. I've spent my life conquering fortresses of stone. I think I shall enjoy watching yours melt. In that moment, when she realized the swap wasn't her ending. It was her weapon. A daughter discarded, a general obsessed, and a love that was written in the stars long before the ice began to melt. This Valentine's Day, join us for a journey where revenge meets a passion that burns hotter than any flame. If you're ready to see the Ice Scholar reclaim her throne and her heart, subscribe to Lotus Tale Studios and hit the bell icon. The most romantic thaw in the Empire begins now. The black steel carriage rolled through the gates of the general's estate with a heavy, final thud. When she stepped onto the stone courtyard, her eyes sweeping over the architecture. Unlike the Wen Manor, which was all delicate lattices and flowing water, this place was built like a fortress. Dark wood, grey stone, and a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight. At her side, General Shang Chin didn't look back. He strode toward the main hall, his heavy boots echoing against the pavers. The east wing is yours, he commanded without turning his head. Do not expect a welcoming banquet. My men have no time for the trivialities of the capital. When she adjusted her scholar's sash, her face a mask of calm. And I have no time for empty ceremony, General. I have cases to review and laws to draft. I assume your library is functional. Shang Chin stopped. He turned slowly, his massive silhouette casting a long shadow over her. His eyes narrowed. Most women, even those of high birth, shrank under his gaze. But when she stood like a solitary pine in a storm. The library is for strategists, he rumbled. Not for poets. I am no poet, she replied softly. I am a seeker of truth. And the truth, General, is that you and I are now bound by a contract neither of us desired. I intend to fulfill my end of the bargain. I expect you to do the same. A dark flicker passed through Shang Chin's eyes. He stepped closer, his scent cedarwood and cold steel filling her senses. My end of the bargain is to keep you safe and fed. Beyond that, Scholar Wen, stay out of my sight. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the main hall. The servants of the Shang Manor were a different breed from those when she was used to. They were efficient, silent, and moved with military precision. But even they could not hide their confusion. As the moon rose, when she sat in her new chambers, lit only by a single lamp, she began to unpack her scrolls, her fingers steady despite the strangeness of the room. Mistress, a young maid named Armai whispered, peeking through the doorway. The general's quarters are prepared, but his personal attendant says he has not ordered his bed to be turned down. When she paused, a scroll halfway open. He is likely in the war room. Leave him be. But mistress, he has ordered a bath. Here. In your chambers. Wen Xi's heart, usually as still as a frozen lake, gave a sharp, unfamiliar tug. Before she could respond, the heavy doors groaned open. Shang Chin entered. He had stripped off his heavy outer armor, wearing only a thin black inner robe that clung to the broad, scarred expanse of his chest. His hair, usually bound tight, was loose, falling like a dark curtain over his shoulders. The servants scurried out like frightened sparrows, closing the doors behind them. The room suddenly felt far too small. I told you to stay out of my sight, Wen Xi said, her voice remaining level, though her eyes were fixed on the scrolls in front of her. This is my manor, Shang Chin replied, his voice a low growl. He walked toward the steaming copper tub that had been prepared in the corner of her room. He didn't look at her as he untied his sash, letting the black silk pool at his feet. Wen Xi's breath hitched. In the Wen household, everything was hidden behind screens and shadows. Here, the general lived with a raw, brutal honesty. Why here? She asked, her voice slightly strained. You have your own wing. Your own quarters. Shang Chin stepped into the water, his back to her. Even through the steam, she could see the maps of scars etched into his skin, reminders of every blade he had stopped for the empire. The Wen family thinks they have discarded you, he said, his voice echoing against the copper. The Yen family thinks they have traded a useless daughter for a military alliance. If I sleep in my own quarters, I prove them right. I prove that you are nothing but a ghost in my house. He turned his head slightly, his profile sharp against the rising mist. I am an emotionless man, Wen Xi. But I am not a fool. If you are to be my wife, you will be seen as such. The servants will know that I spend my nights here. The spies in the walls will report that the general cannot stay away from the ice scholar. Wen Xi stood up, walking toward the tub. She stopped just outside the circle of steam. You are protecting my reputation, she realized. At the cost of your own image of a cold, solitary commander. Shang Chin let out a short, harsh laugh. My image is written in blood, scholar. It cannot be tarnished by a woman's bedroom. He reached out, his hand dripping with water, and gripped the hem of her sleeve. His touch was burning, a heat so intense it felt like it might actually reach the frozen center of her heart. Come, he commanded, his eyes dark with a sudden, simmering hunger that had nothing to do with contracts. Help your husband with his robes. Let the rumors begin tonight. When she looked at his hand, then at his face. For 20 years, she had felt nothing. But as she reached out to touch the wet silk of his robe, she felt a strange, terrifying warmth bloom at the tips of her fingers. The ice scholar was no longer alone in the dark. And the general was no longer as cold as he claimed to be. The morning sun bled through the paper screens of the east wing, painting the floor in shades of pale gold. When she awoke to a sensation she hadn't experienced since childhood, warmth. She shifted, realizing her back was pressed against a solid, radiating wall of muscle. General Shang Chin was still there. He lay on his side, one heavy arm draped possessively across her waist, his fingers curled slightly into the silk of her inner robes. In the dim light of dawn, the iron pillar looked less like a weapon and more like a man. His breathing was deep and rhythmic, the harsh lines of his face softened by sleep. For a moment, when she allowed herself to really look at the man the empire feared. He was a landscape of violence and duty, and yet, in the sanctuary of this bed, he was the only hearth she had ever known. A sharp rap at the outer door shattered the silence. General. Mistress. Armai's voice was trembling. The carriage from the Yen manor has arrived. The Countess Yen and the second Miss Yen Xiao demand an audience. They say they have brought the rightful bridal gifts that were missed. Shang Chin's eyes snapped open. There was no transition from sleep to alertness, he was instantly a predator. He didn't pull away immediately. Instead, his grip on Wen Xi's waist tightened for a fleeting second, his gaze boring into hers. They come to gloat, he rumbled, his voice thick with the gravel of sleep. They want to see if the ice scholar has been shattered by the war beast. When she sat up, smoothing her hair with practiced composure. Let them come. They expect to find a victim. It would be a pity to disappoint them so early in the day. The main reception hall was cold, but the atmosphere was even frostier. Countess Yen sat in the place of honor, her posture rigid, her face a mask of aristocratic disdain. Beside her, Yen Xiao looked like a vibrant peony, draped in shimmering brocade and jewels that Wen Xi recognized as Yen family heirlooms, items that should have been hers. "Ah, Wen Xi," the countess said as Wen Xi entered, her voice dripping with artificial pity. "We were so worried. The general's reputation for rigidity is well known. We brought these silk quilts and medicinal herbs. We thought you might need them for your recovery." Yen Xiao giggled, a sharp, grating sound. "Sister, you look so pale. Did the general forget to light the braziers? Or perhaps he simply preferred the cold?" When she did not take the seat offered below them. She stood in the center of the hall, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "I thank the countess for her charity. But the Shang manor is quite comfortable. I find the general's company provides more than enough heat." Yen Xiao's smile faltered. She looked toward the doorway as Shang Chin stepped in. He hadn't donned his armor yet. He wore a simple, dark robe, his hair loose and damp. But it was the way he moved, not toward the countess, but directly to Wen Xi's side, that silenced the room. Without a word, he reached out and adjusted the collar of Wen Xi's robe, his thumb lingering intentionally against the skin of her neck. It was a gesture of such casual, domestic intimacy that Countess Yen's teacup clattered against its saucer. "The gifts are unnecessary," Shang Chin said, his voice echoing like a low roll of thunder. "My wife lacks for nothing. If the Yen family wishes to show their care, they can start by returning the scholarly scrolls and legal seals that belong to her. I believe they were misplaced during the move." "General," the countess stiffened. "Those are family assets. Now that Xiao is the recognized daughter." "Those are her tools," Shang Chin interrupted, stepping forward. His presence seemed to shrink the hall. "The Wen family may have traded her, and the Yen family may have discarded her, but she is now the lady of this manor. In this house, what she says is law. And what I say is final." He turned to Wen Xi, his expression unreadable to the guests, but his eyes were burning. "Wife, I have drills to oversee. But I find I am loath to leave you. Perhaps you will walk me to the gates." The face-slapping was absolute. He had ignored the countess and the true daughter as if they were nothing more than dust on his boots, choosing instead to publicly dote on the woman they intended to humiliate. At the gates, away from prying ears, when she looked up at him. "You played the part well, General. The countess will be fuming for a week." Shang Chin looked at her, the wind tossing his dark hair. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was no longer just for show. "I was not playing, Wen Xi," he said softly. He leaned in, his shadow enveloping her. "The servants are already talking. They say the general did not leave the East Wing until the sun was high. They say he looks at his wife as if she is the only target worth capturing." Wen Xi's breath hitched. "And what does the general say?" Shang Chin's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes. "The general says that the contract of ice is beginning to smoke. And he wonders how much longer the ice scholar can pretend she doesn't feel the fire." He turned and mounted his black stallion, galloping away without a backward glance. When she stood at the gate, the cold wind whipping around her. For the first time in 20 years, the wind felt sharp. It felt biting. It felt cold. And she realized, with a start of terror and wonder, that she could finally feel it. Because for the first time, she had something worth keeping warm. The morning after the Yen family's retreat, the Shang manor felt different. The air was no longer thick with the tension of two strangers trapped in a cage, it was charged with the electricity of a silent, mutual understanding. When she did not retreat into a corner to brood. She claimed the general's secondary study as her own. By noon, the mahogany table was buried under a sea of parchment, imperial codes, and the heavy scent of sandalwood ink. She was deep into the files of the Zhao clan, the powerful family of the Grand Tutor. They had been siphoning grain taxes from the northern provinces, Shang Chin's home provinces, for years. It was a case that could get a scholar executed, but when she handled the scrolls with the steady hands of a surgeon, a shadow fell across her desk. She didn't look up to know it was him. The scent of rain and iron arrived a second before he did. "You are playing with fire," Wen Xi, Shang Chin said, his voice dropping an octave as he surveyed the incriminating scrolls. "I am a scholar of the law, General." "Fire is merely a tool to light the dark," she replied, finally dipping her brush into the ink. Shang Chin walked around the desk. He was in his light training armor, sweat glistening on his neck from the morning drills. He leaned over her, his hand resting on the back of her chair. The proximity was deliberate, a reminder of the heat they had shared under the covers. "The Zhao family does not use law to fight. They use daggers in the dark," he warned, his eyes tracking the movement of her brush. "You are my wife. Your safety is my primary objective. Then protect me in the halls of power, General, while I dismantle their lies on paper." She looked up, her face inches from his. "Or are you afraid that a mere woman will finish the war you started on the battlefield?" A slow, dangerous smirk tugged at the corner of Shang Chin's mouth. He reached out, his calloused thumb catching a stray drop of ink on her lower lip. He didn't wipe it away, he smeared it, his gaze darkening with a sudden, sharp hunger. "I am starting to realize," he whispered, "that I did not marry a scholar. I married a revolutionary." That night, the Iron General once again failed to return to the Master's wing. In the East Wing, when she was leaning over a map of the tax routes, her hair falling forward in a silken curtain. She felt the door click shut. She didn't turn around when the heavy weight of his arms wrapped around her from behind, his chest a solid wall against her back. "It is late," Shang Chin rumbled into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "The candles are burning low. Just one more route, Chin," she murmured, using his name for the first time without his title. The general stiffened, then let out a low, predatory hum of approval. He didn't pull away. Instead, he began to undo the pins in her hair, one by one, letting the dark tresses spill over his armored arms. "The servants are placing bets," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "They want to know how the ice scholar manages to keep the general in her room until the morning bells. They think you have cast a spell on me." When she leaned her head back against his shoulder, her eyes fluttering shut. "And have I?" Shang Chin turned her in his arms, his hands sliding up to cup her face. His eyes were no longer those of a commander, they were the eyes of a man who had found the only thing in the world worth holding on to. "You have destroyed my peace," he confessed, his forehead resting against hers. "I go to the barracks, and I see your face in the dust. I go to the council, and I hear your voice in the wind. I am a man of stone, Wen Xi, but for you, I would burn the empire to ash." He picked her up then, the scrolls forgotten on the floor. As he carried her toward the bed, the stuffy image of the general was completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate devotion. The next morning, the head steward was found standing outside the East Wing with a tray of tea, his face bright red. The general had not emerged for the dawn drills. In fact, the sounds of laughter, genuine, light laughter, had been heard coming from behind the ladies' closed doors. For the iron pillar to miss a drill was unheard of. For him to be heard laughing was a miracle. By noon, the news had reached the Yen manor and the imperial court. General Shang Chin was compromised. The ice scholar hadn't just survived the war beast, she had tamed him. But as the sun reached its zenith, a messenger in the Zhao family colors arrived at the gates. He didn't bring a gift. He brought a summons. "The Grand Tutor requests the presence of Scholar Wen," the messenger sneered. "To discuss her unusual interest in the northern tax records." The war was no longer just in the bedroom. It had arrived at the front door. The summons from the Zhao clan was a declaration of war, but nature decided to strike first. By evening, the sky over the capital turned a bruised, sickly purple. A sudden, violent temperature drop swept through the valley, bringing with it a biting wind that rattled the heavy shutters of the Shang manor. Inside the East Wing, the change was catastrophic. When she was standing at her desk when the first gust hit the window, she froze. It wasn't just the cold, it was the memory. Suddenly, she wasn't 27, she was 6 years old, standing on a stone balcony with the door bolted behind her. Her breath hitched. Her fingers, which had been deftly holding a brush, turned white and rigid. "Armai," she whispered, her voice thin and reedy. "The braziers, light them all." But before the maid could respond, Wen Xi's knees buckled. The ice scholar, who had stood tall against the countess and the general alike, collapsed into a heap of silk on the floor. Shang Chin was in the war room, slamming his fist onto a map as he discussed the Zhao summons with his lieutenants. If a single hair on her head is touched, I will march the black cavalry through the Grand Tutor's front gate. General. Armai burst in, her face pale with terror. The mistress, she's fallen. She's as cold as a corpse, but she's burning with fever. Shang Chin didn't wait for an explanation. He moved with a speed that blurred the air, leaving his stunned officers behind. He burst into the east wing to find a scene of chaos. Maids were scurrying with blankets and hot stones, but when she was shaking so violently her teeth were chattering a sound like breaking glass. Her eyes were open but vacant, lost in a blizzard only she could see. Out. All of you. Shang Chin roared. He scooped her up, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. She felt like a shard of ice. He didn't put her in a chair or call for a physician immediately. He sat on the edge of the bed and pulled her directly into his lap, wrapping his massive, fur-lined cloak and his own body around her. "Elevener," he growled, his voice raw with a fear he had never felt on the battlefield. "Look at me. You are in the Shang manor. You are safe. The doors are open." "It's dark," she whimpered, her face buried in the cold iron of his chest. "Brother, don't let her lock the door." Shang Chin's jaw tightened until it ached. He understood then. This wasn't a simple fever, this was the frozen heart-shattering. He realized that for 20 years, she hadn't been emotionless, she had been surviving. For the next 12 hours, the general did not move. The physicians arrived and were sent away with a glare that could have withered stone. The servants watched from the hallway in stunned silence. The iron pillar, the man who refused to show weakness, was sitting on the floor by the bed, cradling his wife like she was the most precious jade in the world. He didn't just hold her. He spoke to her. The man of few words whispered stories of the northern sun, of the heat of the desert, and of the fire he felt every time she looked at him. "I am the hearth, Wen Xi," he murmured against her temple, his eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. "Focus on my heat. I will burn for both of us." As the dawn broke, the shaking finally stopped. Wen Xi's eyes cleared, focusing on the rough, scarred hand that was currently rubbing her fingers with agonizing tenderness. She looked up to see Shang Chin, his hair a mess, his robes rumpled, his face etched with a vulnerability that ruined his legendary image forever. "You stayed," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I will always stay," he replied, his voice breaking. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. "The world thinks I am a man of stone, Wen Xi. Let them. As long as you know that I am yours to command." By noon, the manor was buzzing. The general had missed the morning report. He had missed the arrival of the imperial censor. He had spent the night acting like a common lovesick fool, according to the head steward's whispered accounts to the kitchen staff. But the general didn't care. He walked out of the east wing with Wen Xi in his arms, carrying her to the garden to catch the midday sun. "The Zhao family expects a scholar to answer their summons today," Shang Chin said, his eyes turning to flint as he looked toward the city gates. When she leaned her head against his shoulder, the warmth of the sun finally reaching her bones. "And what will they find instead?" "They will find the wife of the general," he replied, a dark, protective smirk touching his lips. "And they will find that the ice scholar has finally melted into a flame that will consume them all." The imperial court was a forest of marble and whispered treachery. When she entered the Grand Hall of Justice, she was no longer the ice scholar who moved with the stiffness of a winter shadow. She walked with a fluid, dangerous grace, draped in deep crimson silks that mirrored the heat now simmering in her veins. At her side, Shang Chin was a silent thunderstorm. He didn't wear his full battle armor, but his formal robes were black as a moonless night, and the jade-hilt dagger at his waist sent a clear message: "Touch her, and I will paint this floor with your blood." The Grand Tutor, Zhao Yuan, sat at the head of the tribunal. He was an old man with eyes like a vulture's, hidden behind a mask of scholarly virtue. "Scholar Wen," he began, his voice thin and patronizing. "We summoned you to discuss your clerical errors regarding the northern tax records. It is a grave matter to accuse noble houses of theft." When she stepped forward, the sound of her silk robes like the hiss of a snake. She didn't look at the other judges, she looked directly at Zhao Yuan. I did not bring errors, Grand Tutor. I brought receipts. I brought the ledgers of the grain merchants you thought were silenced. And I brought the testimony of the widows in the north whose husbands starved while your silken robes grew heavier. The hall went silent. Zhao Yuan's face turned a mottled purple. Arrogance. You are a displaced daughter with no lineage to speak of. You think the general's bed gives you the right to slander me? Shang Chin's hand moved toward his dagger, his eyes flashing with a predatory light, but when she placed a gentle hand on his arm. It was a soft touch, but it stopped the general in his tracks. The court gasped. No one had ever dared to stay the hand of the war beast. My lineage is written in the law, not in the blood of the Yen or Wen families, when she said, her voice echoing with a power that made the high ceilings vibrate. And as for the general's bed, it is where I learned that a man of true honor protects his people, while a man of greed only protects his shadows. The tribunal was forced into a recess, the judges terrified by the sheer volume of evidence when she had produced. As they retreated to a private chamber, Zhao Yuan's son, a pampered brat named Zhao Jin, blocked their path. You think you've won, scholar? Zhao Jin sneered, his eyes traveling over Wen Xi's body with a disgusting leer. Once the court is over, the general will tire of your cold skin. My father will have you in the labor camps by the new moon. I might even visit you there myself. He didn't get to finish his sentence. Shang Chin moved so fast the air seemed to crack. He didn't use his blade. He grabbed Zhao Jin by the throat and slammed him against a marble pillar, the sound of bone meeting stone echoing through the corridor. You speak of my wife again, Shang Chin growled, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that made the windows rattle, and I will not send you to a camp. I will send your head to your father in a box of northern ice. Chin, let him go, Wen Xi said softly, walking behind him. She didn't look at the gasping Zhao Jin. She looked at her husband's back, the broad, protective expanse of a man who was no longer just a contractual partner. Shang Chin dropped the boy like a sack of refuse. He turned to Wen Xi, his chest heaving, his eyes still dark with a possessive fury. He looked at you as if you were prey, he hissed. I am nobody's prey, she replied, reaching up to smooth the ruffled collar of his robes. But I am glad to know my hunter is so diligent. That night, the victory at the court was celebrated in the only way the Shang manor knew how, with a silence that burned. In the bedroom, the general was restless. He paced the floor like a caged tiger until when she walked to him, unbinding her hair. The ice scholar was gone. In the moonlight, she looked like a goddess of fire. You were reckless today, she whispered, stepping into his space. I will be more than reckless for you, he replied, his hands finding her waist and pulling her flush against him. I spent my life protecting borders of dirt and stone. I didn't know that a single woman could be a territory more worth defending than the entire empire. He kissed her then, not with the tentative curiosity of the first night, but with a raw, desperate hunger that spoke of months of suppressed desire. The iron pillar was crumbling, and in its place was a man who couldn't breathe unless he was buried in her scent. The servants outside the door shared knowing looks as the candles remained lit long into the early hours. The rumor was no longer that the general was obsessed, the rumor was that the general had been reborn. But as the two lay in the tangled silks of the dawn, a message was being delivered to the Wen manor. Wen Zhou, the only person Wen Xi truly loved, had crossed the border. And he wasn't coming alone. The Empress's mid-autumn banquet was the most glittering snare in the capital. Every high-ranking official and noble house was present, draped in their finest silks to hide their sharpest daggers. For the Yen family, it was meant to be their crowning moment, the night they would officially present Yen Xiao as the true jewel of their lineage, cementing her engagement to a high-ranking prince. When she arrived not as a displaced scholar, but as a storm cloud. She wore a gown of midnight blue that shimmered with starlight silver, her hair held aloft by a single obsidian phoenix pin. Beside her, Shang Chin was the embodiment of lethal prestige. He had abandoned his usual austerity for a mantle of black fox fur and a belt of beaten gold. As they entered the imperial garden, the music faltered. The whispers began like the rustle of dry leaves. Look at the general, a duchess whispered behind her fan. He hasn't looked at the emperor once. His eyes never leave her. They say he sleeps in her chambers every night, another replied. The iron pillar has turned into a silk slave. Shang Chin heard them. He didn't care. He leaned down, his lips brushing Wen Xi's ear in a way that was far too intimate for public eyes. The Yen family is at the third table. Your mother is wearing the rubies that belonged to your grandmother. Shall we go and reclaim them? Wen Xi felt a spark of cold fire. Not yet, Chin. Let them peak before they fall. The moment arrived during the toast. Countess Yen stood, her face glowing with triumph as she gestured to Yen Xiao. We are blessed to have our true daughter returned to us. A woman of such grace and blood, unlike those who were mere cuckoos in our nest, stealing the warmth of a home they did not earn. The table went silent. All eyes turned to Wen Xi. Wen Xi didn't lower her head. She stood, her wine cup held steady. It is a fascinating thing, Countess, to speak of blood and grace. But grace is not found in rubies stolen from a daughter's dowry. And blood is easily spilled when it is fueled by lies. You arrogant girl, the Yen patriarch roared, slamming his fist on the table. You are a woman of no standing. You live on the general's whim. Shang Chin stood up then. The air in the pavilion seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't raise his voice, but the low, vibrating growl of his tone sent a shiver through the emperor's guards. A woman of no standing? Shang Chin stepped forward, his shadow looming over the Yen table. Wen Xi is the lady of the Shang manor. She is the savior of the northern provinces. And as of this moment, she is the sole proprietor of the Shang military supply contracts. He reached into his sleeve and pulled out a heavy, blood-red anklet of obsidian and gold. In front of the entire imperial court, the most powerful general in the empire knelt at Wen Xi's feet. The court let out a collective, strangled gasp. A general of his rank kneeling to a woman was unheard of. It was an act of total, absolute submission. Gently, his calloused hands that had snapped the necks of enemy kings, lifted the hem of Wen Xi's midnight silk. He fastened the anklet around her slim ankle, the red gems glowing like embers. I gave you a contract of ice when we met, Shang Chin said, his voice carrying to every corner of the garden. Tonight, I give you a bond of fire. Let it be known, whoever touches a hair on her head touches the general's sword. Whoever insults her name insults my blood. He stood and kissed her hand, his eyes burning with a possessive heat that left Yen Xiao pale with envy and the countess trembling with rage. The Yen family's jewel was suddenly a common stone compared to the woman the general had just crowned his queen. The ride home was a blur of shadows and the scent of crushed jasmine. Inside the carriage, the general's composure finally broke. He pulled Wen Xi into his lap, his hands tangling in her midnight hair, his kisses desperate and marking. You shouldn't have knelt, Wen Xi whispered, breathless against his lips. Your reputation. My reputation is a prison I have finally escaped, Shang Chin growled, his face buried in the hollow of her neck. I want them to know, Elevenor. I want the whole world to know that I am your subordinate in the bedroom and your shield in the world. He reached down, his fingers tracing the cold gold of the anklet he had just placed on her. This anklet has a bell so small only I can hear it. It tells me where you are. It tells me that you belong to me. When she pulled him closer, her frozen heart now a roaring furnace. I am not a territory to be conquered, General. No, he whispered, his eyes dark with a love that bordered on obsession. You are the only home I have ever had. But as the carriage pulled into the manor, a tall, travel-worn figure stood at the gates. He carried a sword with a Wen family crest and a face that mirrored Wen Xi's own. Wen Zhou had arrived. And behind him, the Wen family's true scandal was about to explode. The gates of the Shang manor groaned open to reveal Wen Zhou. He stood beneath the flickering lanterns, his travel cloak dusted with the red clay of the borderlands. For 20 years, he had been the only warmth in Wen Xi's life, and as she stepped from the carriage, the stoic scholar Wen vanished. Brother. When she didn't walk, she ran. Wen Zhou caught her, spinning her around as he used to when they were children playing in the hidden corners of the Wen gardens. Shang Chin stood by the carriage, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, his eyes narrowed. He was a man who shared nothing, especially not his wife, but the visible relief on Wen Xi's face stayed his jealousy. I heard the rumors at the border, Elevenor, when Zhou whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. They said you were traded. They said the Wen family threw you to the wolves. He pulled back, his gaze shifting to the looming shadow of Shang Chin. I see the wolf has grown quite fond of his prize. Shang Chin stepped forward, his presence a heavy, commanding weight. I do not treat her as a prize, Wen Xi. I treat her as the master of this house. Wen Xi smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression that proved he shared his sister's blood. Good. Because tomorrow, we go to the Wen Manor. Our parents have enjoyed their stolen peace for far too long. The next morning, the Wen household was in a state of frantic preparation. Ning Jin was obsessing over the tea service, desperate to impress a visiting official, when the front doors were not opened, but kicked off their hinges. Wen Xi led the way, his face a mask of cold fury. Behind him walked Wen Xi and Shang Chin, a trio that looked like the harbingers of the apocalypse. "Zhou, you're back," Ning Jin cried, rushing forward, but she stopped dead when she saw Wen Xi. What are you doing here? You are a Yen now. You have no right to enter this." Silence. Wen Zhou's voice cracked like a whip. "I have spent 10 years on the frontier protecting this empire while you sat here and systematically destroyed the sister I loved. I know about the balcony, mother. I know about the blizzard. And I know about the swap." The Wen patriarch stumbled out of his study, his face pale. "Zhou, be reasonable. The family reputation. The family reputation is a lie built on the back of a 6-year-old girl." When Zhou reached into his robes and pulled out a stack of imperial deeds. "I am the heir to the Wen estate. And as of this morning, I have petitioned the emperor to dissolve my inheritance." Ning Jin let out a strangled scream. "You would throw away your future for her?" "I am not throwing it away," Wen Zhou said, stepping aside to reveal Wen Xi. "I am transferring it. I have officially named Wen Xi as the primary beneficiary of the Wen family fortune. The lands, the warehouses, the titles, they are all hers. You and father will retire to the ancestral village on a pittance. If you ever set foot in the capital again, I will have the general's men arrest you for child endangerment." When she stepped forward, her red anklet chiming with every step, a sound that now signaled the end of their reign. She looked at Ning Jin, the woman who had locked her in the cold. "You once told me that a daughter is just a tool to win a husband's favor," when she said, her voice low and steady. "Look at me now. I have the favor of the general, the loyalty of my brother, and the keys to your house. You are the one in the cold now, mother. And I find I have no blankets to give you." That night, after the Wen parents had been escorted out in disgrace, when she sat on the edge of the bed in the east wing. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a hollow ache. Shang Chin entered, moving with a softness he reserved only for her. He didn't speak. He knelt before her and began to undo the red anklet, his hands warm against her skin. "It is over, Elevener," he whispered. "The debt is paid. The ice is gone." When she looked at him, tears finally blurring her vision, the first tears she had shed in 20 years. "I thought I would feel happy. But I just feel empty." Shang Chin pulled her down into the silks, his body a heavy, protective shield. He kissed the tears away, his touch more intimate than any physical act. "The emptiness is just room for something new," he murmured, his hands tracing the curve of her spine. "The servants say the general is a fool for staying in his wife's bed every night. Let them say it. I will spend the rest of my life filling that emptiness with fire." He pulled the quilts over them, locking her in an embrace that promised she would never be abandoned again. The ice scholar was gone, replaced by a woman who finally knew the heat of a true home. The destruction of the Zhao clan was not a battle fought with swords, but with the steady, relentless stroke of Wen Xi's brush. Within a month of her brother's return, the Grand Tutor's mansions were sealed by imperial decree. The evidence Wen Xi had unearthed, the stolen grain, the forged ledgers, the silenced witnesses, was so absolute that even the emperor could not look away. On the day of the final sentencing, the capital was held in a breathless grip. The ice scholar stood at the center of the high court, her voice ringing out like a silver bell as she read the list of crimes. She was no longer a displaced daughter or a contractual bride, she was the conscience of the great Yang Empire. Beside her stood Shang Chin. He did not say a word, but his hand never left the small of her back. The court saw a general whose ferocity had been tempered into a protective, unwavering flame. When the verdict was delivered, the Zhao lineage stripped of rank and exiled to the salt mines, the cheers from the common folk outside the gates could be heard for miles. As they exited the hall, a bedraggled figure blocked their path. It was Yen Xiao. Gone were the shimmering brocades and the arrogant smirk. Her biological father, the Yen patriarch, had been implicated in the Zhao's fringe dealings and stripped of his military titles. Yen Xiao was no longer the jewel of the Yen clan. She was the daughter of a disgraced house, her engagement to the prince dissolved like mist. "You did this," Yen Xiao hissed, her eyes bloodshot. "You took my home, my status, my future. You were supposed to be the sacrifice, Wen Xi. You were supposed to be broken." Wen Xi stopped. She looked at Yen Xiao, not with hatred, but with a profound, quiet pity. "I didn't take your home, Xiao. You burned it down with your own vanity. You focused on the jewelry while I focused on the truth. You relied on blood, but I relied on my mind." Shang Chin stepped forward, his shadow enveloping the trembling Yen Xiao. "And she relied on me," he rumbled, his voice a low warning. "Move aside. You are blocking the path of the woman who saved the northern provinces. You are in the presence of greatness, and you are far too small to see it." Yen Xiao collapsed onto the marble steps, sobbing, as the general and his lady walked past her without a second glance. The face-slapping was not a strike, it was the total, crushing weight of their indifference. That evening, the Shang manor was filled with the scent of blooming plum blossoms. The Iron Pillar had declared a week of celebration for his men, but he was nowhere to be found in the banquet hall. In the east wing, the candles were low. When she sat by the window, watching the moonlight dance on her red anklet, she felt the heavy, familiar warmth of Shang Chin behind her. He leaned down, his chin resting on her shoulder, his arms circling her waist with a proprietary strength. "The Empress sent a scroll today," he whispered into her ear. "She wants to name you the High Chancellor of Legal Affairs. The first woman to ever hold the seal." When she turned in his arms, her eyes bright with a fire that no winter could touch. "And what does the general think of having a wife who outranks half his staff?" Shang Chin let out a low, vibrant laugh. He picked her up, carrying her toward the bed he had claimed as his only true home. "The general thinks that his wife is the only law he intends to follow for the rest of his life." He laid her down on the silks, his gaze traveling over her with a hunger that had only grown with every passing day. "The rumors are true, Elevenor. I am obsessed. I am compromised. And I have never been more powerful than I am at this moment, holding you." As the Iron General pulled the quilts over them, the manor finally fell silent. The war was over. The revenge was complete. And in the heart of the empire, a new legend had been born, the legend of the scholar and her general, and the fire that turned ice into a kingdom. The first snow of the year fell softly over the capital, but inside the Shang manor, the cold was a forgotten memory. The estate had been transformed. No longer a sterile fortress of stone and shadow, it was now a place of vibrant life. Silk lanterns in deep cinnabar hung from the eaves, and the sound of scholarly debate often drifted from the gardens where Wen Xi mentored the next generation of imperial lawyers. Wen Xi stood on the same balcony where, a year ago, she had arrived as a displaced bride. She wore a simple robe of white fox fur, her hands tucked into a hand warmer embroidered with the Shang family crest. She watched the snowflakes dance, but she didn't feel the hollow, marble-like numbness of the past. She felt the crispness of the air, the tingle of the frost, and the profound, heavy warmth of the man standing behind her. Shang Chin didn't need to say a word. He stepped into the light, his massive frame shielding her from the wind. He wrapped his arms around her, his large hands covering hers. "The northern borders are peaceful," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her hair. "The Zhao name is a ghost. And your brother sends word that the Wen estate has flourished under your legal reforms." When she leaned her head back against his shoulder. "And the general? Is he satisfied with his quiet life?" Shang Chin turned her in his arms, his eyes softening in a way that would still shock his soldiers. He reached down and gently touched the red anklet she still wore. The bell gave a tiny, clear chime. "My life has never been quieter, and yet my heart has never been louder," he confessed. He looked at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Do you remember what you told me on our first night? That you didn't ask for my heart. Wen Xi smiled, a radiant, soulful expression that made the general's breath catch. I was a fool then, Chin. I didn't realize that a heart like yours wasn't something to be asked for, it was something to be earned. Shang Chin picked her up, his movements filled with a familiar, hungry grace. As he carried her back into the warmth of their chambers, he stopped at the threshold. The servants are still whispering, you know, he teased, his lips grazing her forehead. They say the High Chancellor and the great general are far too indulgent behind closed doors. They say we set a scandalous example for the youth of the empire. When she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer as the heavy oak doors swung shut, locking out the winter forever. Then let them gossip, she whispered. Let the whole empire know that the ice scholar finally found her hearth. And let them know that the iron pillar has a very soft heart for his wife. In the hearth of the room, the fire crackled, casting long, dancing shadows of two souls who had turned a contract of convenience into a love that would outlast the dynasty. The winter was cold, but for Wen Xi and Shang Chin, it would always be summer. The empire is safe, the enemies have fallen, and the ice scholar has found her eternal hearth. This Valentine's Day, we celebrate a love that defied contracts and melted the coldest armor. We hope this story of Wen Xi and Shang Chin warms your heart as much as it did theirs. To keep the romance blooming all year long, subscribe to Lotus Tale Studios. Happy Valentine's Day to all our listeners, may you find a love as fierce and protective as a general's devotion. Hit the bell icon to join us for our next legend.